the recorded audio while you view the slides. This is the recorded lecture for our first lesson in environmental communication. This week we are learning about the formation of environmental beliefs. Be sure that in addition to listening to this lecture, that you also complete all of the assigned readings, as you will have a comprehension quiz based on the concepts they cover. Let's continue with our lesson. For each lesson this term, I will start by stating learning objectives that students will be able to achieve through the completion of all parts of the lesson, including the lecture and readings, as well as the assignments. For our first lesson, students should be able to first define environmental ideology and environmental self. They should be able to understand the importance between experience with the natural world and self-identity, to explain how a personal environmental belief system develops, and to assess and reflect on one's personal environmental identity. So let's get started. So first, let's unpack some key terms and key assumptions for both communication generally and environmental communication specifically. We know from our textbook's introduction, by the way, if you haven't already read the introduction, please do so, that environmental communication as a concept or set of concepts refers to the quote, the various ways we communicate about the natural world. And that comes from page 2 in the introduction. Importantly, the messages that inform our communication about the natural world are both intentional and not intentional. They can be verbal and nonverbal. And importantly, besides their actual content, they also communicate something about our relationship with the natural world. Also in the introduction, Dr. Corbett, author of the textbook, explains how environmental communication is multi-layered. Be sure to review page 6 to get an understanding of those layers. Importantly, she notes that the root of these layers is ideology, and that's where our first lesson begins. First, let's unpack this term, or this idea of ideology. For the purposes of our course, I want you to divorce yourself from popular uses of that term. That is, in the public sphere, like news and political media in particular, we often tend to think of ideology as a bad thing. Particularly related to politics, it becomes referred to as something like an overt stance of total subjectivity relative to the topic. But from a communicative standpoint, we are always creating and sending messages rooted in particular systems of thought, like a perspective or a worldview, that structure what we see as right and wrong, what we understand as appropriate, and even what we think of as common sense. So in our course, ideology is not a bad thing, but it is important that as producers and consumers of messages, that we understand ideologies and begin to recognize them. Now consider Dr. Corbett's definition of environmental ideology found on page 13 in our book. And I have it here on the slide for you. Clearly, after our basic definition of the general concept of ideology, we can at least understand the connection of ideology to the environment, even as the name of the concept suggests. But I want you to hear in this definition presented on the slide how Dr. Corbett adds another important dimension to this idea of ideology. Ideologies structure our thinking and our action. So communication is more than just the creation of a news story, or the production and dissemination of a film, or the creation and dissemination of some other type of message. In fact, our actions communicate. We call that nonverbal communication. Sets of practices, used by groups of people, actions by groups of people, they communicate. The actions themselves communicate. And in really deep and complex ways, we assimilate all of those messages with sort of the typical types of messages that we hear about the environment, and then we act accordingly. Okay, so the third point on our slide indicates that multi-layering that I mentioned that Dr. Corbett discusses in the introduction. Importantly, because environmental belief systems inhabit each of us individually, and they are also products of our culture, what that means is we are complex products of a particular culture and the experiences we have, as well as our individual idiosyncrasies. And so together, these layers of childhood experience, sense of place, and culture and history inform the particular environmental belief system that we hold on an individual basis. So let's unpack some of those factors through which our environmental belief systems are developed. And importantly, what I want you to begin to understand is how that environmental belief system informs an environmental self. And you'll hear that concept, environmental self, reiterated in Cantrell's article. So while in our textbook chapter, Corbett differentiates between the three elements identified in the slide, that is history and culture, childhood experiences, and sense of place, I want you to, and she sort of differentiates between them as if they're autonomous items that linearly construct our identities. But I want you to consider how they influence one another in complex ways, and then how they all work together to create your individual environmental self. So of course she, in much more detail, goes over each of these items. But just as a sort of summative conversation, let's talk through each one. Of course, history and culture influence each of us in deep ways through things like religion, a history of colonization, even the history of the rise of capitalism, industrialization, and development. In ways that we probably don't even consciously recognize anymore, we have what we think are common sense values and ideas related to what the natural world should be used for, or even what we think it is. Even how we define the natural world often comes from a history and culture that influences us through things like religion and so forth. Those cultural and historical values help structure our our experience in the natural world. Think for a moment and consider how you have had each of the three types of experiences discussed in that section of the chapter. For example, what kind of direct experiences have you had with the natural world? Do you like to ski or hike, for example? Do you garden or cook? Those can inform direct experiences that you have with elements from the natural environment. Think about indirect experiences you may have had with the natural world. Have you ever been to a zoo or a natural history museum? Those are indirect experiences because we get to see animals and rocks and so on, but we're not directly experiencing them as if we were hiking or interacting with those animals out in the wild. And what about vicarious experiences with the natural world? What kinds of vicarious experiences have you had? Do you ever watch nature shows or documentaries? Those can be considered vicarious experiences with the natural world. Thinking about all three of those, which of the three types of experiences do you think you've had the most of? I think for me, I would have to say I've had the most experience with indirect and vicarious experiences with the natural world, given my particular upbringing. And those have certainly structured how I have lived both as a child and into adulthood in really important ways. So importantly, the chapter tells us, and the Louvre excerpt from his book, the other reading assigned for this week, tell us that childhood experience with nature is important because it stays with us through adulthood in really important ways. And by extension, and this is where the Louvre article will come in, the opposite is also true. A lack of particularly direct experience with the natural environment and more salient for today's youth, the increase in vicarious experiences with the natural world can have really sometimes detrimental effects. And in fact, Louvre will introduce to you this concept of nature deficit disorder. And this is exactly the perspective that he's coming from. Okay, that final factor here on the slide, our sense of place. Importantly, our sense of place is built on a highly subjective attachment to the meaning of a place. So thinking back to all those various ways that communication circulates around us, even places communicate to us in different ways through particular symbolic salience. Typically, The place that most significantly informs our sense of place is where we grew up, either the physical location of our home, sometimes even a room in our home, or perhaps a favorite childhood vacation spot or hideaway like a treehouse. These places give us personal feelings of comfort and security and belonging and rootedness, and they can inform how we think about the environment. For example, someone living in the inner city with lots of car traffic, air pollution perhaps, and limited access to trees or parks or so forth, they will have a very different view of, quote, the natural world than someone who grew up on a farm, for example. Importantly, our experience in those places that inform our sense of place help us make sense of the world and consider our place within the larger world. So these factors work together to help each of us form a particular identity related to the natural world. This is why, as Corbett explains, people with different social roles, informed perhaps through different experiences and their own senses of place, can view the same physical setting through different lenses. For example, individuals with access to outdoor leisure activities like mountain climbing will have very different values for the environment based on their interactions with it than, say, someone who plays a lot of video games. And this is not to suggest that the mountain climber has better values than the video gamer, but it does suggest that there are differences with their own itinerant advantages and disadvantages, if you will. But importantly, those different ideologies and identities informed by those different experiences and senses of place construct each of those individuals' actions in different and really important ways. And yet, interestingly, on the flip side, because of shared culture and history, for example, in my classes, many U.S. students will identify, quote, the environment through similar images, things like wilderness, mountains, faraway places, and really pastoral scenes of tranquil forests or streams or so forth, become really common images that these students, with their own various experiences and senses of place, based on that common history and culture, that they have similar images. And then perhaps, importantly, what gets excluded from those images are things like farms, the city park, or even their own backyard. So what I want you to hear in this first lesson is that you are the first layer, or certainly a container or a vessel that assimilates these systems of environmental communication that circulate around us. So it's important that we start our exploration of environmental communication with considerations of ourselves. Along with reading this first chapter from the Corbett textbook, please also be sure that you review the other assigned readings, including the 2-page excerpt from Louv's book about nature deficit disorder and the study completed by Cantrell about environmental self and sense of place, for more exploration with some of the specific concepts introduced in Corbett's book. Please be sure that you also complete your first comprehension quiz, and also see the assignment on Canvas for assessing your own personal environmental identity, as this will help you begin to apply these concepts to your personal sense of self. Thank you very much, and let me know via email if you have any questions or concerns.